Hello, so I want to do a little bit of a bigger demo on doing wood, especially because we use them in floors. So I've got this little parquet floor here sketched out just with a pencil. I'm going sort of off this research image, though the picture of it on my computer has a bit more vibrancy. So I always like to pick my brightest, warmest tones and use those as my initial layers. The more worn your wood is, the cooler toned it is usually. So just make sure you're checking your reference images. But I've got a brush that's a little piecey, a little chunky actually, and it's about the width of what each of these boards are. So I've made a small glaze with an orange tone and some glazing medium, but you could also do it with water or you could do it with a dry brush technique. And I'm randomly picking boards to start warming up, and you can see that if I use really light pressure, I get this like very fine kind of streaky grain because the brush is a little raggedy, and we are using that to sort of fake our wood grain. So I'm going to do almost the whole thing with just this brush, and sometimes I turn it sideways to get a little thinner, but we're just starting to build up some different variations and different colors. When you're doing wood grain, you always want your brush to move in the direction of the wood grain. So on this, we're going to be flip-flopping back and forth all the time. So this is a bit of a sienna mixed with red and glazing medium, so it's a little transparent, and I'm going ahead and just really quickly adding it into each of these. It's going to dry a little clearer, allowing some of the yellow to show through, but we're already starting to build up our value and also our saturation on these so that they're not so bright yellow, right? I think that's the key with doing wood, is taking lots of different passes of kind of shallow streaks, and I like doing them all in translucent levels so that when they are all stacked on top of each other, you get these layers of texture underneath that are revealed that sort of fake the wood grain. So I'm doing all my warm colors first. I started with a yellow, I did an orange, I'm doing this kind of sienna orangey red that I made. And we're always wanting to make sure that we stop and start and keep the defining edges really dark. It's tempting to leave those floating light, but if you put your brush down, it'll put the most paint where you put it down, and then when you pick it up, it'll either deposit or kind of scratch out the paint from underneath it. So keep your strokes running all the way down each individual piece of wood that you're doing. So I'm making a very translucent purple here just to start deepening some edges. Purple opposite of yellow, so should mute it down a little bit. And I'm using a bigger brush because I'm not as concerned about getting it into individual boards. I'm wanting to kind of darken the places where the boards meet, the beginning and the ends of each board, and also different squares so that they're a little different tonally. So this green is going to mix in really well. Green is the opposite of red, so that orangey red sienna that we just put in, it's going to neutralize that a bit and add some interest to the wood grain. Always trying to not create the same pattern over and over again in each one, so I'm trying to pick different boards, different places, continually hopping around the whole painting so that I don't get too repetitive in how I'm treating it. Once again, you can see how translucent that green glaze was. I'm trying to swipe everything on the white so you can see it. So next I've got a blue glaze. Kind of a navy color, and I've got a lot of medium in it, and I'm using this to sort of push in and tone some different boards, some different areas, the cracks in between them. As you start working on different types of wood, more wood, you're going to see that like newer wood has very thin cracks, and like the older and more aged it gets, the more pronounced those cracks in between the boards kind of get, and the darker the contrast gets. And also the less uniform the boards will be between each other. So I'm kind of pushing these. The floor looks pretty worn to me, so I'm pushing them to have a little bit less straight cracks. I'm not going to use a ruler to do them. I'm pushing them to have a little bit bigger cracks and seams in between. And I'm also adding a lot of variation into the wood because it seems like maybe an old floor, it's been walked on, it's had lots of things happen to it, stains, sunlight, different treatments. So that's where it gets a lot of these different colors from. So this is a little bit of a like sienna with a bit of white in it, and a glaze that's about 50-50. It's not as translucent as some of our cooler tones were. And I'm using this with a larger brush and kind of glazing each square on its own, and it's unifying and flattening the layers underneath it because it's not entirely translucent. If you have a newer floor, doing layers like that can be really helpful because it keeps it from looking so choppy. New floors have a lot more uniformity. And then while that is still wet, I'm going through with a bit of a clear yellow glaze and scratching a few boards back into it just to make sure we don't lose that variation. This is a purpley leaning towards plum tone that I'm using to darken and add shadows. In the research image I saw, there's some boards that look like they're really, really dark brown. So that's what we're working on here. Since there's a lot of yellow, that purpley tone hits that yellow tone and sort of comes out once it's all sandwiched together, being closer to like a deep gray. So on the left-hand side, I've done the streaks and the in-between of the boards with a paintbrush, just a really thin one in a dark brown. And then I'm showing you what it looks like if you do them with a micron, which is a lot thinner. On either of them, you don't want continuous lines often. You kind of want broken lines. The micron will make these look like a lot closer. The boards are a lot more controlled, versus the paintbrush makes them a little bit more, well, painterly. And also, like they have larger seams, larger cracks. So you can also use a thin brush with a little bit of shadow to add some various, just pick a few boards and add a little bit of extra wood grain texture too. I'm taking this deep reddish brown and using that as kind of a shadow and a warm up in some areas to unify some boards. I realized my research image was certainly a little redder and a little more uniform than mine, so I'm using this to sort of cover some areas that maybe got too colorful, too choppy, and to add depth, especially at the beginning and the endings of the boards, because that is, like I said, you get this kind of paintbrush mark sometimes at those, so this is a nice pass to help hide that. So if you have a more uniform floor that you're looking at, you would certainly use maybe not the green. You could mix a little bit of the same brown into all the colors that you use so that they kind of fit together tighter. You might do less layers. Maybe it's just the yellow, the reddish brown, and the purpley color. It really depends on what the exact texture is. So one thing that I have found is older boards tend to go a little lighter, that wear and tear. So I've got a dry brush technique here. I've got a very, very dry brush. I'm back to the brush that's about the width of each of the boards. I've mixed kind of a cream with the medium brown wash that we use to unify everything, and I'm just picking a couple boards in each thing and highlighting them. That white color is opaque, so it kind of hides everything underneath it and unifies also. I'm not pushing very hard. I'm letting the brush just sort of float so that I get that grainy, draggy texture that looks like maybe the raised areas have gotten sort of bleached. This one just looked different than all the other ones, so I've tinted it back with that medium brown. So some of the cracks and things are still a little inconsistent in these. Some of the areas are too bright, so I've made a mix of Van Dyke brown, which is kind of a dark medium gray brown, and a transparent medium, and I'm just glazing over all of the edges to unify them, to add kind of a shadow line to them. You'll still see some of the micron showing through, of course, and some of the other wood lines that we did, but this sort of adds that shadow and makes sure that we're not getting like a bright highlight from brush strokes at the corners. I like to try to keep my strokes when I'm doing board seams to the length of the board. So instead of making a perfect checkerboard, it makes each board has a little bit of wobble to it, a start and stop. Seems like it would be easier, of course, to do all like long lines the whole length of the paper, but sometimes that can be a little fake. If it's brand new though, those would be almost perfect. So you could do them with a ruler if you wanted. So you can see we've got a pretty good variation here. starting to really be able to identify each of the different boards. I like a little bit more highlight to help unify everything together. And because it helps the floor feel a little more aged. Like wood gets lighter usually as it gets older, and as it gets worn and bleached by the sun, and if it has like a polyurethane on it, then that also starts to get kind of cloudy sometimes. So those highlights really help with everything. So this is our finished painting. One thing with an older floor and acrylics, the acrylic paint can have this high shine to it, which makes it seem like they're recently varnished. So if you're working with anything that's had a little bit of wear and tear on it, it's nice to take a matte varnish or a matte medium to it, just to help kind of dull it down. My matte medium isn't perfectly matte either, so it makes that sort of like appropriately floor finished varnish. I like to use a dry brush to sort of buff it in so that there's no perfect brush marks in it, no raised areas that can catch a highlight later on. So that dry brush just to kind of buff the medium in, and this is the difference in the color of it once it's dried, so that really helps it feel a little bit more unified and also more correctly aged. If you wanted to, you could go through again with the micron marker and add just some little seams and cracks anywhere that sort of got lost. It will look a lot darker going on top than it does when it's been kind of layered underneath things, so be aware of that. Sometimes like a dark brown Sharpie works great for touch-ups and that too, but I hope that helps.